observation, it's predictive power. However, what I see is a problem when that predictive power in our worldview gets exalted, and I see it as a real problem. It limits science. It limits our capacity to say, hey, let's talk about your observation and what are the domains of applicability of your observation. Like, you can say you see a tree, but what if you start saying, oh, I see, I see. Let's say we both then see something that a third observer does not see, which often happens in science. Right. Two groups will observe something, and then a third says, wait, I don't see that. Right. Yeah. Then you engage a conversation, and you say, what did you do? What did you do? What did you do? And that is the dialogue that I think people miss out when they say science is about facts.
Right, because it's dependent on that intersubjective.
That's right.
So, like peer reviews.
You got it. You got it. Do you have a background in science?
Very weak. I was an engineer and then 2 years of med school, so like I do not consider myself a scientist.
Gotcha.
At least familiar with some of those things.
No? And here, do I need to plug
if
out?
you don't, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Close this. Yeah. No, I agree. Hi. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I've heard her name. Okay. 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 British? Irish. Well, I like to think I do the usual physics thing.
Lots of people in science are not interested.
Oh, no, of course. Because it's just a time issue, right? I think it's so important because it is my scientific process. And it also keeps me aware of the minuses of the work I do. Because I am constantly encountering people who do not think like this. And so I see the limits in the dialogue. I see when they say, oh no, that can't be. It can't be given X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Yes, but what if, right? And I realize for a lot of scientists, they do not think in that what if thought. They say, I know the bounds of this, my experiment, then I ramp that up. And we need people like that. We need people who they're not concerned with interconnection. Because then they can laser focus into some system for 40 years, and we learn from their measurements. But I think we are devoid, and our modern world is a product of that picture of science, which we also need people like to think like myself, who can actually see a little bit of from these individual trees. And so that it was really more out of a sense of, I don't want to see people turned away from science because they think, oh, it is a very hierarchical and also completely depersonalized discipline. There's a process, and even the
It was like when you say you know, friends, relatives,
all of
everybody into like sort of
the scientific communities that are opposed to this, he says, and go to any scientific conference. I could never present these.
I mean, you said that you became interested in this.
Personally,
Not in the science.
no, I mean, it wasn't only just talking. It was, reading scriptures, it's reading philosophy, it's engaging with these questions that are at the core of understanding existence and being like, why am I here doing this? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? It's like, how do you conceptualize my purpose? And really asking that question, what am I created to do? That's kind of, I think, the motivation. But then you've seen some of the references.
I'm going to be introducing you.
The
Okay.
groups like AAAS have been phenomenal in integrating that space of dialogue between science and religion, faith and spirituality. So like they've given me a context, even this, to talk about it. Thank you.
I'd like to be able to reset this.
you do a favor to our students if you pull it in on time. It's hard to get speakers to.
Yeah. I've been trying to reset the timer so I can keep track of my own time. Usually if I
Hit
click...
that, right there. Try that. Is that not working? There it goes.
Oh,
So when you're
okay.
ready to start,
Just
just
click
hit
it.
that, and it'll restart the time. Or yeah, I guess wait, hit. Let's see something. Restart. Pause that.
There you go. What you did? Yeah, you did it.
Yeah, just it restarts it. So I think if I actually went to restart it, it's going to. So that's about 2 seconds in.
And
But
then
you
if
just
I
hit that, or hit this right here, and then
Uh-huh.
it'll start your timer.
Hit which one?
The one on the left.
Okay,
Left on the
okay.
bottom.
He's gonna get the crowd back in.
Okay. You may run for
I don't know. Can you wait till after the talk? I mean, if you go over time, we can do what we did, just have people come up. But you also need to
get to lunch.
restroom break.
Oh, yeah, there's one more talk.
Yeah. Yes. So what did you think about the first talk this morning? Students probably felt that way too.
He drew some folks I recognized, but it was a novel long writer. I just had to go down to the
Thomas comes back and starts. Am I people still filing in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Not too far bad. We're 10 minutes behind.
Yeah, it's not too bad. Okay, I think I think we need to start the next lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Schloss, who is a distinguished professor of biology and T.B. Walker Chair of Natural and Behavioral Sciences at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, where he also directs the Center for Faith, Ethics, and Life Sciences and serves as senior scholar for the BioLogos Foundation. He taught at the University of Michigan and Wheaton College. He was a Croissant Fellow at Notre Dame's Center for Philosophy of Religion, a Plumer Fellow at St. Anne's College at Oxford, and a Witherspoon Fellow in Theology and Science at the Center of Theological Inquiry. His academic work involves evolutionary accounts of altruism, moral cognition, and religious faith and practice, and the philosophical and theological implications of evolutionary theory, and he's written many important articles on these topics. Please welcome Dr. Jeff Schloss.
Well, it really is a pleasure to be with you today, both because the topic of our exploring together is one that's close to my heart. But I also have to say, just being here in this community for the last day has been a respite. It's been an oasis to my soul in a time of stress. And I want to thank you for being who you are, hospitable in Christ. So here we go. Dr. Limna sent me, shortly after inviting me to the conference, a quote. Oops, let me see if I can get this to work, right? This is not working. Try it now. Quote from Maurice Blondel, which he suggested is something of a rationale for our time together. Our world has expanded through the social and natural sciences. One cannot remain true to Christianity and be content with a mediocre explanation, a limited outlook which represents Christ as an accident of history, isolating him in the cosmos as if he were an episode without proper time and place. One cannot represent him, this one's important, as an intruder, an alien in the crushing and hostile immensity of the universe. One of the things that's progressively emerged over the last 100 or 150 years is that the materialistic and reductionistic picture of the universe has in fact planted it as precisely hostile, not only to the existence of God, but to the existence of any telos or purpose. What we call the new atheism might really be called the new nihilism. And in order to then to think, and the implications are either there is no such being as God, or if there is and he entered the universe and become embodied as we believe that Jesus Christ has, there must be some Gnostic dimension to this, where the universe, the stuff, the creation itself is intrinsically inhospitable rather than welcoming of its creator. And that's what I want to take a look with you at this morning. I want to look at two different aspects of this. One is the notion of evolutionary history, the evolutionary story. Is there any indication that it's at least consonant with the God of purpose, a God of providence? And then take a look at the human role within that drama. So the philosopher of biology, Alex Rosenberg, says, Darwin puts the capstone on denying that there is any meaning or purpose to the universe, its contents, or its cosmic history. The premier biologist, evolutionary biologist, George Gaylord Simpson, says man is the result of a purposeless and natural processes that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. Now, of course, a process itself may be purposeless, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't used to an end of purposive attainment. And that's the first thing I want to look at with you today, the notion of purpose. Now, I have to start by saying that when we speak of purpose, we can mean two different things. We can mean that the operation of something is purposive in the sense that it's purpose tracking or purpose seeking, that has mechanisms which measure its place and then has other mechanisms for adjusting its trajectory or current state. So a wine cooler would be purposive in this case. It measures the humidity and temperature and it adjusts it. But something could also have purpose in the sense that it's not purpose-seeking, it's purpose-suited. So a deep cave may be purpose-suited for a wine cellar. It has constant temperature, but it doesn't do anything to track its temperature. My little boy, when he was young, he came home with a rock that he found at the beach where there were holes eroded in it. And he said, "Daddy, you could use this on your desk as a pin holder," and I still have it to this day. That has purpose, but it's not purpose-seeking. So, by the way, these two dimensions correspond to two different things that the sciences do. They describe the attributes of things. And one question we might want to ask about evolution, the cosmos in general, is does it have any attributes which suggest that it is being employed for the attainment of a divine purpose? And then the natural sciences also propose causal explanations. We could also ask the second question, is the cosmos purpose-seeking? Well, I'm going to focus on the first. And I have loved the last two talks. I have to say that my wife teases me that I take 45 minutes to decide which pair of socks to pack, and I took 8 years over undergraduate studies to decide whether to major in biology or philosophy. I still privileged to collaborate with philosophers, but today I really am going to describe some biology for you, which I think has opportunity for theological and philosophical reflection. I want to start by saying, although this is germane to the issue of purpose, another way of phrasing this is there any plot to the big history of evolutionary history? Well, that question has been answered, argued, debated about ever since Darwin. Darwin, by the way, thought there was, but most recently there's been emerging consensus amongst evolutionary biologists in notions of what are called major evolutionary transitions. There are a number of very influential books and research papers. Now, I want to start by saying a major evolutionary transition in this field of emerging research isn't just a big change, like the movement of aquatic life onto land or the development of a nervous system or backbones from invertebrates. No, this is a series of thematically consistent jumps with respect to one particular identifiable aspect of how biology is organized, living systems are organized, and there is a series of jumps in what we call cooperative interdependence. And here they are. At some point, you had an aqueous mixture of molecules which could catalyze their own self-replication, and they became bound in membrane bound in the earliest primitive cell or protocell. Previously autonomous, independent, but interacting molecules now bound together. And then you had a transition from the earliest simple cells called prokaryotes, with no structures inside those cells, physically joining to form eukaryotic cells that now have little organelles within themselves that do photosynthesis or that do respiration. Your mitochondria are doing that right now. Prokaryotic to eukaryotic. Again, you have the loss of autonomy for the gainment of greater function. And of course, you have many times in algae, animals, plants, fungi, single cells coming together to form multicellular organisms, which now can do all sorts of things that single cells cannot do. You have solitary organisms coming together to form eusocial organismic colonies. And by the way, a colony of bees can regulate its body temperature more precisely then you can regulate your own. Coming together opens up immense opportunities for the achievement of biological function. But as always, there's relinquishment of autonomy. In the case of eusocial insects, they give up their capacity to reproduce. Virtually every member of the colony but one. And then finally, I would have never predicted this when I was a graduate student in evolutionary biology, would not have predicted this would be seen as a major transition, primate to human sociality. The scale of human cooperation mediated, like no other organism, by symbolic and conceptual communication. So take a step back here and just make a couple of comments on the thematic continuities of these major transitions. They all involve cooperative interdependence. Now that second word is really important. It's not just cooperation. It's what biologists would call obligate rather than facultative cooperation. You have to do it. And if you don't do it, you're dead. There's no life apart from the body. And in fact, that's Paul's vision of our life in the body of Christ. It also involves specialization or division of labor. The reason it's so good to come together is you can parcel out tasks, and then you can do more tasks. You can get eye cells and ear cells and olfactory cells. There's a change in information transmission. I'm not going to get super technical here, but in the very earliest cell, you just have strings of DNA. And in eukaryotic cells, you have this DNA organized into chromosomes, bound in a cell membrane in the nucleus. And with humans, you have information transmitted outside the cells by books and language. And finally, you have the relinquishment of reproductive autonomy. You're not just making as many individuals of yourself as you can anymore. In fact, in an insect colony, you don't make any. The cells in your body make a finite number, governed by a higher authority. So all of these together means you have an intensification of life's capacities. What we see over the history of life is not just an increase in cooperative interdependence, but whatever you, by the way, biologists find it very hard to define life, but there's all sorts of descriptors of life they give. Sensation, metabolism, locomotion, reproduction. It turns out all of the capacities for all of these things increase through this series of major evolutionary transitions. Now, just one last little fine-tuning. Within these transitions, then we have a sequence of amplifications. If we just look at the multi-cell transition. Over evolutionary period of time, we actually have an increase in the number of different cells, from invertebrates to lower vertebrates, amphibians and reptiles, to birds and mammals. The number of different cells doing specialized labor increases. And one other thing increases. The total metabolic intensity of organisms increases. Now just do a little thought experiment with me. You have more workers with more specialized skills, and you're paying them better, and you're giving them more resources. You're just going to do everything better. Everything better. So here's one graph of homeostatic precision, just the ability to control what's going on inside of you in deference to the environment. By the way, Paul suggests this is true of the spiritual life as well. He says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed. And that's what it means to be alive physically, by the way. We often say, oh, I'm stressed out. I wish I were in equilibrium. Well, if you were in real equilibrium, if your body temperature equaled ground temperature, if your pH equaled ground pH, there would be a word for that, and it's corpse. So these things increase over time. I'd love to show you more graphs, and maybe I should have, but I was told this would be a popular audience. But so just for fun, here's what we have now. Locomotion, we have organisms that can run 80 miles an hour. Gray whales can migrate 16,000 miles. Arctic tern migrates roughly up to 50,000 miles a year over a 30-year period that equates to about 3 round trips to the moon. An eagle can see a mouse at 3 miles away and can see ultraviolet and infrared. Many frogs can see colors at night. The Arctic fox, one of the areas I work on is the physiology of thermal regulation. An Arctic fox has such efficient insulation that it never gets in nature cold enough to make it shiver. Minus 90 degrees, it's still saying, so what? I'm not turning up the heat. Darwin said, as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress toward perfection. I don't want to present a saccharine view of evolution. There's lots of predation and red in tooth and claw. There has been lots of debate since Darwin about this notion of progress. If anybody's interested, the best and I think fairest-minded book on this is by the philosopher, historian of science, Michael Ruse, called From Monad to Man, the Idea of Progress in Evolutionary History. But I do think it is fair to say a majority doesn't rule when it comes to truth, but the idea of progress, at least in terms of the refinement, the progression, and the fine-tuning of biotic endowments is widely testified to by just looking at the empirical record. So the philosopher Hans Jonas spoke of this as the ascent of soul. Over the course of life's history, we've just gotten more biotically potent. The famous chemist, philosopher, and Catholic, Michael Polanyi, well over a generation ago, in a prominent article in Science, one of the premier English-speaking journals in the world, said, the evolutionary sequence gains a new and deeper significance. We can recognize then a strictly divine progression, rising from the inanimate level to ever higher additional principles of life. He took some hits at that time for saying that. But it turns out that many of my colleagues in evolutionary biology now affirm it, and one particular leading worker, Urs Zethmari, refers to this specific quote. He says, this progress, referring to Polanyi's quote, is nowadays described as a series of major transitions in evolution, is often due to the emergence of new cooperative units. By the way, both Polanyi and Zethmari are Ukrainian. I'm going to. So, Father, we pray for those people. Now, take one last step back. There's been some work specifically looking at not the transitions themselves and not these flashes of animals that I just showed you, but developing a synthetic theory for how major evolutionary transitions actually result in an increase in what biologists are beginning to call autonomy. Yes, we obey the laws of physics, just like the chairs you're sitting in, but in a strange sense, living systems are autonomous in the sense that they work as agents to control their own internal conditions, and if we're humans, to control our own decisions and where we want to go and what we want to eat, and not just driven by factors in the environment. An influential recent book by Bernd Rauschenbach on the origin of autonomy, a new look at the major transitions in evolution. This, Jesus says that I've come that they might have life and have it more abundantly, and there's some supernatural transformation that Christ effects, but life itself is not just a dichotomy, that different creatures can have it in different degrees. And over this series of major evolutionary transitions, it looks like the nature, the potency, the depth of life capacities themselves have increased. Zethmari, who I mentioned earlier, speaks of breath-giving cooperation. Here he's speaking of the mitochondria emerging in a eukaryotic cell, but this notion of coming together actually breathes life, breath into life. I have to say there's an irony here that I find sublime. While autonomy is relinquished at the lower level, it's actually enhanced at the higher level. the capacity to sense the environment, to control internal conditions, to sustain organismic integrity through a range of emerging capacities, the very qualities that we associate with life itself are elaborated over this sequence of evolutionary transitions that in order to enter, you have to give something up. And I don't want to romanticize or get schmaltzy here, but I think that life itself is so constructed that it reflects what Jesus himself says life is about. He who would cling to his life will lose it. And that's true in the biota that surrounds us as well. Okay, one little piece that is just emerging. One of the things that we're now recognizing happens over evolutionary time is that lifespan increases. This is an area where I'm really interested in the big debates over what causes increase in lifespan, or the reverse of that would be what internal factors in us cause aging and senescence. But lifespan increases. Now, do a thought experiment with me. If you buy a house, it's got some leaks in the roof, so you need to have a new roof put in, but the city says, you know, a freeway is coming through this house. We're going to have to tear it down in 5 years. You're not going to buy a 30-year roof. One of the things that increased lifespan does is strategically it enables organisms to invest in more expensive equipment that will serve them over the long haul. And what I'm talking about is brains. Brains are the most expensive tissue in your body. If you're only going to live a few days, not much warrant to putting a lot of investment in brains. And as we see, the actual cerebral content of organisms actually scales to lifespan, scales to other things too. And as it scales to lifespan, I mean, one of the reasons that it pays off is because you have more time to learn. You have more time to use it. So one thing that happens is that you have greater capacity to learn, greater cerebral content. But one other thing, and by the way, one other thing happens. If you have a very short amount of time to live, you better crank out as many offspring as you possibly can. And one of the things that we see, the biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who was very critical of evolutionary notions of progress or directionality, the one trend he did affirm is a trend toward what we biologists call case strategists, which is longer living with greater investment in a smaller number of organisms. And we see this happening. As we kind of move up the evolutionary continuum, we see smaller number of offspring over a longer lifetime. And in primates, we see parental care that's off the map, continuing late into the lifespan of the individual, and in fact, continuing to the next generation. This is me with my grandson, Bodie, playing the piano together. And I thought last night of the comment the Pope having conversation with the cosmonauts. One of the cosmonauts indicated that he was inspired to make this mission by his grandfather. And the Pope says, it does me good to hear this, who I hear is himself a great appreciation of the legacy of grandfathers. But this would be unique to case strategists and humans. So the physician and philosopher Leon Kass says the ascent of soul has meant the possibility both of an ever greater awareness of and openness to the world. It's produced a hierarchy of powers, both to be affected and to affect the world, touching, smelling, tasting, hearing, seeing, moving, exploring, desiring, remembering, judging, speaking, naming, thinking. All these forms of openness two things, all these forms of openness are the distinctive of the human soul. Many of them apply to others, but Cass would want to say they culminate in humanity. So what about humanity? Recent book by the philosopher James Rachels called Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism says Darwinism undermines both the idea that man is made in the image of God and that man is a uniquely rational being. The idea of human dignity turns out, therefore, to be the moral effluvium of a discredited metaphysics. Now, this wasn't just made in a book by a philosopher for philosophers. So I mentioned Science, one of the premier English-speaking journals of science in the world. The other is Nature, where Watson and Crick published their Nobel-winning DNA work. Nature, a while back, had a front-page editorial with all deference to the sensibilities of religious people. The idea that man was created in the image of God can surely be laid aside. Now, one question is how a scientific journal could make a comment like that. We just heard a wonderful exhortation to recognize that we have science beyond science and that there are limits to what the sciences can propose. But they thought they could say that because there was nothing distinctive about human beings. Now, by the way, even if there weren't, there would be questions of divine choice. Could God confer upon us certain responsibilities as he did on Abraham, even if there wasn't any? But it turns out we don't have to ask that question because there is an emerging consensus that there are radical distinctives of human beings. Now, lots of proposals here, and lots of them go back to Aristotle, the notion of the rational soul, and all through the Enlightenment, that there are some aspects of reason that were distinctive to humans. That may well be, but what biologists have been looking at most recently is simply behaviors that can be observed. Do we do anything without trying to climb into the heads of other animals that no other animals can be seen doing? And the answer is yes. It is the scale of human prosociality. I would say love, but it's the scale of prosociality. So one recent article claims human cooperation exceeds that of all other species with regard to scale and range. But those two words are important. What they mean by range is the size of human cooperative groups, and not just the size, who's in them. No other animal species cooperates with individuals with whom they're not genetically related, that's called kin selection in evolutionary biology, or with whom they don't have an established reciprocal relationship. Humans do that all the time, and we're the only species that do. But also the scale. We're the only species that systematically, though too rarely still, gives without being fully compensated. Biologists call that altruism. The New Testament seems to call it agape. So an influential paper in Nature a while back says human altruism is a powerful force and is unique in the animal world, and therefore concludes human societies represent a huge anomaly in the animal world. Other papers say we're orders of magnitude greater than any other species, a spectacular outlier with respect to all other animal species, a spectacular evolutionary anomaly. Some of the authors, I almost, if I got their papers as a teacher, I almost would think they're plagiarizing one another's work because the language sounds so similar. Now look, a quote doesn't make things true, but I do want to convey to you the fact that my colleagues in evolutionary biology, without any agenda trying to get to a particular place, have found it increasingly difficult to deny the fact that there's something radically different about human beings, and it's love. Then how about this major transition? Not only is there this radical difference, but we're posited. By the way, some people call these transitions a series of evolutionary big bangs. It's really a new thing. So humans are really a new thing. But some people criticize this. So this one is debated, and I want to say it should be debated. And here's why. The 4 aspects of transition, which I mentioned to you: intense cooperative interdependence, humans have that for sure. Specialization of labor, humans have that for sure. Information change, humans have that big time. We pass along information outside our genes, but we haven't relinquished our reproductive autonomy. Every one of the, some people do it volitionally, but we are capable of reproducing. There's this tension. Some people think we're not a transition. Other people think we are. It might be fair to say, and some people think we're stuck. We're in between the transition and it hasn't happened yet. In fact, the biologist E.O. Wilson at Harvard, who just died recently, says man has achieved an extraordinary degree of cooperation with little or no sacrifice of personal survival and reproduction. Exactly how he alone has been able to is the culminating mystery of all biology. Well, Wilson and this stuck in a transition stuff is in a way just saying what many Christians have suggested all along. Alexander Pope's essay on man, Pope says, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great. Pascal says, man is neither angel nor brute. Now here I might expect him to say, and if you think you're an animal, you're going to give yourself freedom to act like one. No, he does the opposite. He says, and the unfortunate thing is, he who would act the angel acts the brute. If we don't understand our need for the supernatural, our fallenness, our dustiness, we won't end up achieving our telos. You know, the scripture says he has created us a little lower than the angels, but also says, there is forgiveness with thee, for thou knowest our frame, that we are but dust. We are, neither angel nor brute. And I'm not suggesting evolutionary theory gives us an account of the fall. I don't want to do any attempt at making that concordance, but it does look like biologically itself we're stuck. Our flourishing lies in completely yielding to that which is bigger than our own agenda, and yet we haven't biologically completely yielded the drive toward that agenda. Okay, so home stretch. Wilson says it's the culminating mystery of all biology. Well, then how do we navigate this? On the one hand, what I'm about to say shouldn't surprise anybody. We have known it for thousands of years. On the other hand, the biosciences have denied it for much of the last century. And it's interesting to see my colleagues come back to this. So one of them is morality. Now, there are many, many different components of morality. I almost hate using the word for one thing. There are moral feelings, there are moral norms, there are moral institutions. Some aspects of morality, like a sense of fairness, where you'd rather have nothing rather than be treated unfairly. That's not morality in terms of treating other people, but at least it violates the rule of rational self-interest. I'd rather have nothing than be given something less than I deserve. Well, it seems we see this in other organisms. So I'm going to show you a 30-second video clip of work by primatologist Franz de Waal and Sarah Brosnan, where capuchins have been taught they get food if they give the experimenter a rock. They'll eat a cucumber, but their favorite food is grapes. Tasty, sweet. You got 2 of them next to each other in different cases. Check this out, and there's sound here.
Grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape.
I'm so sorry, only because I have never failed to play this 30-second tape and get anything short of unanimous laughter from the I'll just tell you what happens. The one on the left gives him a rock, he gives him cucumber. The one on the other side gives him a rock, he gives him a grape. The guy on this side sees it, and he's getting really excited. Gives him a rock, gives him a cucumber. He looks up, he takes the cucumber in his hand, and he throws it at him. And then he shakes the cage. So there may be, but in human morality, that appears to be two distinctions. One is that we get upset if somebody else is not treated fairly. And we have the capacity to evaluate our contribution to that. So Darwin himself said a moral being is one who is capable of comparing his past and future actions or motives and of approving or disapproving them. We have no reason to suppose that any of the lower animals have this capacity. The developmental psychologist Jerome Kagan says that morality, Norman's right here, but it's even more complicated, that morality involves the ability to recollect a past action, then to consider a counterfactual, to imagine that you could have chosen differently. That's a complicated cognitive trick, that you recognize your choices and you can imagine that you could have chosen differently. To evaluate it in a light of a moral norm, and then regret what you did choose and purpose to choose differently later. No reason to believe that other animals have that capacity, although that's a climbing into the head capacity. But the second aspect of morality, at least in humans, is that we evaluate our actions not just based on how we perceive they influence others. We need that. But even when the perception isn't clearly there, we evaluate them on the basis of norms, on the basis of principles that we trust will optimize our behavior so as not to hurt others. Both those things are uniquely human. And then the last, religion. So as an evolutionary biologist, I think my field has been the hotbed since I was in grad school, vicious religious antagonism. The evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins describes religion as a virus, more deadly than the smallpox virus, but more difficult to eradicate. The fascinating field about evolutionary biology is that there's been a profound switch on this in terms of recognizing that evolution funds morality in many cultures, and it also oftentimes helps accomplish what rules alone can't do. Insofar as that we have, number one, the idea of supernatural reward and punishment, but number two, a relationship with a being who calls us to these rules, who empowers us to yield to them, who comforts us in the distress that might tempt us not to yield to them. So Voltaire said if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. He does go on to say, but all nature cries out that he does exist. And there is an emergent literature in evolutionary theory. This is a very influential paper on the origin and evolution of religious pro-sociality. That religious belief constitutes an especially effective cultural innovation, or for those of us who are Christians, divine revelation enabling us to love each other. There's a lot of data on this. This could be a talk in and of itself on distinctions between the religious and non-religious people. There have been several major books that talk about the role of religion in the emergence of large-scale human cultures. And one of the most fierce advocates of the religion as virus view, Helena Cronin, a student of Richard Dawkins, recently wrote an article, Why I No Longer Believe Religion is a Virus of the Mind. Quote, I was wrong, and the idea of religions as viruses of the mind may have had its day. Even Daniel Dennett, philosopher who's viewed as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, consents that we have built-in desires to reproduce and to do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal. But we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact does make us different. Dennett is affirming the powerful capability of religious beliefs to usher human beings into a portal of behavior that no other species exhibits. Well, why doesn't he love religion? Well, because, as we all know, religion can usher us into these behaviors, but religion also gave us 9/11, that we can make radical sacrifices out of religious commitments. But sometimes they're massively hateful out of commitment to a religious in-group. And sometimes, if we follow Jesus, there is no in-group. It's love your enemy. So I want to close with what I opened with. Maurice Blondel says, there is in man a life better than man. And it's not man who can sustain life. Something divine has to dwell in him, absolutely impossible and absolutely necessary. It's that it is properly the notion of the supernatural. Let's see. How am I doing on time? I'm 40 minutes. So we'll do this. Yeah. So I went fast, and this is going to be faster. I just want to say, there's consonants. The ideas of human exceptionalism as an ultimate distinctive or telos of love, that's what is exceptional in humans. This trajectory over the course of life of gain versus relinquishment, and yet humans stuck in a middle state, all of these would be consonant with findings in the biosciences and religion playing a crucial role. But I want to close with cautions as well. First of all, these are consonant but not demonstrative of the truths of faith. Both the previous talks said something like this in a different way. So this isn't an attempt to prove faith from the natural world. What it is an example of viewing the natural world through the eyes of faith. We see things there that we might not have noticed elsewhere. This is not a moral arc. Philosophers distinguish between moral and non-moral evil, or natural and natural evil. Well, there's natural beneficence too. Over these transitions, we have the increasing capacity to cooperate. But it's not intrinsically moral, including in us. We can twist these things, and we can cooperate toward non-moral, immoral ends. So for human beings, this makes us, our condition is necessary but not sufficient to be the beings that God wants. We are by nature receptive, but by nature needing God's intervention grace. And finally, I would just suggest that we avoid a naturalist essentialism, that we can identify any particular capacity that makes someone human. Once we do that, then an aged person in a coma in an old age home, or an embryo, or a disabled person, their humanity is questioned. So it's not a question of material capacities. Those material capacities are gifts that God has given us to enjoy what doesn't require material capacity, and that is his love for us. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to stick with the plan we established after the first talk to have people, if they want to ask questions individually, and then take a 10-minute break, and then come back at, so it's 11:15. So we'll start the next talk at 11:15 with Father John. Thank you.